Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Uncensored CMO. Now, in this episode, we're going to be talking about one of the most successful unicorns in the US, DoorDash, valued at an astonishing $40 billion. And I'm joined in this episode by their CMO, Kofi Amoo Gottfried, who's been running the business for 5 years. And he talks about the obsession they have with the customer, the innovation, product innovation they're doing to meet their customers' needs, and the role of marketing in driving awareness and conversion for the brand. He is an amazing storyteller, and he's got an incredible career, from running his own agency across Africa to being agency side to working at Facebook to finally turning up at DoorDash 5 years ago, just before COVID and just before they IPO'd. This is an amazing conversation. There is so much in here. I know you're going to enjoy it. Here it is. Kofi, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
It's good to have you, man. It's good to see you.
Here.
Yeah, we were both in Cannes, weren't we, like a few weeks ago?
We were. It was a madcap week.
Yeah, and you had quite the time as well.
We did. We had a great Cannes, really across the company, between sort of winning some important awards, but also continuing to build relationships with our partners, talking to people about our ads business on DoorDash. I also, for the first time, judged, which was quite an experience in and of itself. So it was a busy week.
Now, I've recorded podcasts sat next to judges, and it's not as glamorous as people might think, right?
It is not.
There are no windows.
No, 3 days.
Everyone's cramped in.
3 days.
It's a long day. Just looking from the outside, it doesn't look as glamorous as maybe you kind of think it is.
I mean, I think the value of it is getting 3 days to spend with some of the smartest people in the world just talking about the work. And our jury was incredible. It was like 10 people, but all from different countries. So having a really global perspective and getting challenges and pushes and input based on where people were coming from. And you walk away feeling like you made like lifelong friends. Like I had these people that I spent, probably 80 hours over three days.
Literally.
It's just like, and you just get to learn a lot about each other and about the work. So like, that's the beauty of it, but it's a grind.
That's amazing. You were judging a category, weren't you, that you won last year?
Yeah, we were judging the PR category. We had won the Grand Prix in PR last year for the work that we did with Gut around Valentines Day. And so I think I was asked to come and judge the category this year, and I didn't actually know what I was getting myself into in terms of the amount of work, but it's definitely not an experience I would trade. It was great.
Now, I have to say, I reckon the Gut Valentine's Day is one of the most creative, one of the best insights I've ever seen. Just describe it, because I think it's very clever, isn't it? The insight behind that idea.
So we're on this journey at DoorDash, which is about demonstrating that you can get anything on DoorDash. DoorDash started as a food delivery business, but the original vision for DoorDash has really been about empowering local economies. And that means being able to get everything from every business on your street, helping those businesses grow, driving earnings opportunities for Dashers, helping consumers save time. So if you go back and look at the Y Combinator submission from our founders, they talked about it as a FedEx for the local economy. So it was from the beginning was everything's got to be on here. But we started in food because that's the most frequent sort of use case. And so about 3 years ago, we started branching into other categories. So now you can get flowers on DoorDash. So how do you tell the story of the fact you can get flowers? We found this incredible insight in our data that based on basket sizes, we assumed that most of our consumers were single at the time. So then we went, how do you talk about singles and Valentine's Day and like what is the connection there? And that led to this notion of like, actually, how do you celebrate yourself on a day that everyone's talking about couples? How do you celebrate self-love? Which then led to this idea of the self-love bouquet, which Gut came up with, which was like an incredible idea. And the notion was like the hottest sex toy on the internet at the time was this thing called the rose, which is a woman's sex toy shaped like a rose. And so we created these bouquets that were 11 roses and one the rose. And just to communicate that you could buy flowers. Yeah. And oh, by the way, also sex toys on DoorDash.
There's nothing you can't get on DoorDash.
There's nothing you can't get. And so that then became the activation around it. And the fun thing about it is like we ended up creating a product that didn't exist. And we're able to do that and then put it through our own self-owned stores on DoorDash, which I call Dash Marts, and they sold out in minutes. It was an incredible, it was super fun. It was one of those where I'll never forget having the person who ran that project presenting that to our leadership of the company on a call with like 200 people.
Oh,
and then
nice.
you're sort of going like, so what are we doing
for
Valentine's Day? It's like, well, it's a sex toy and the rose.
Yes.
But,
yeah. Get comfortable in your seats. We're going to talk about this. This is brilliant.
Exactly.
Well, let's come back to Cannes because I'd love to talk a bit more about what you've won this year and the journey to it. But bring us to how did you get to here? So just if you could summarize kind of a bit of your journey to here, because you started out, you came to the US, didn't you, from Ghana, and then
that's right.
Yeah, tell us about that.
So I left Ghana when I was 17 to come here for college, and I'll start by saying that like I'm a product of access, right? So I grew up in Ghana. The way I was able to come to the States was I had a college that was willing to pay for me to go there. So I went to this incredible college called McAllister College. It's in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I always say, if you want to learn about culture shock, and if you look it up in the dictionary, moving from Ghana to St. Paul, Minnesota is right up there. But it was an incredible place. It's very international. So my freshman class, something like 20% of us were fresh off the boat from somewhere, from about 80, 90 countries. So a very international place. I studied economics there. I thought I'd end up in finance. I ended up doing this internship my junior year at Leo Burnett. And it was totally by accident. But I fell into this business, and I found that this intersection of like creativity, psychology, commerce, just like really appealed to me. I didn't even know advertising was a thing. And so after that internship, I decided that this is what I wanted to do. And so after I graduated a year later, I started my career at Burnett. So I came back. I worked on the Kellogg's business for about 6 years between Chicago and London. So Tony the Tiger, Toucan Sam, Snap, Crackle, and Pop. Those are my guys. Great fundamental sort of blue chip consumer brands in terms of thinking about marketing and a CPG focus, which meant you really had to think about how the sales engine worked. So it was just a really great education, not just in marketing, but in business. And after 6 years, I grew up as an account man. After 6 years, I moved over to Wieden & Kennedy, and I switched into strategic planning. And so I went to Wieden in Portland from Burnett and worked on the Nike account. And so I ran strategy on Nike for a couple of years, which was transformational for how I thought about this business. I was supremely unqualified for that job. And starting that job, I felt as much of a fish out of water as I'd ever been, because this was the most creative agency in the world on the most creative account with impossibly high standards. And I was like a guy who had been shilling, cereal. It was sort of like, how do you build credibility in that?
That must have been a good pitch, to go from cereal to the Nike account.
Yeah, to the Nike account.
And the strategic planning as well, which
the
is
strategic planning it was a net new job. It was a net new job. But it was incredible, because I think like what Leo taught me was like the fundamentals. Like how you build a brand, how do you do repeatable processes, how do you like figure out how things sell through the system, how do you figure out all the like nuts and bolts of it. And then Wieden took all of that and then supercharged and went, okay, forget about all of that. Now there's chaos and creativity and like bet on things that you don't quite understand. And what does that look like? And how do we get work that's the best in the world consistently? And it was an unusual place because the bar there, everyone forgot the thing you did the week before. So we would ship something that was incredible, that the whole world would be high-fiving about. And then you'd come back the next week and be like, you guys are all terrible. And you're like, oh my God. We just did this thing.
Can I dine out on that for a few
Everyone
weeks?
loved it. It's like, no. And like the bar was always just getting higher and higher and higher. But it was an incredible couple of years on that business doing, what I still consider some of the best work I've done on that brand. I was part of did the strategy for the Olympics in Beijing, did a bunch of work on Nike running when that came back to Wieden, did great work with LeBron and Kobe, and also getting to spend time with like your childhood heroes. Just like you go to a meeting and you're like, I'm talking to LeBron James and Kobe Bryant.
How cool is that?
It doesn't get it doesn't get any better than this. And I thought I would like stay there forever.
Yeah.
And then an opportunity came up that I couldn't say no to, which is Publicis called. And they said, hey, we're thinking about setting up an owned agency network in West Africa. It would be the first of its kind. It's not an affiliate model. We're actually going to invest. We have a key client there in Nestle. Would you be willing to go back to Ghana and open an agency for Publicis on behalf of Nestle, responsible for 23 countries? And at the time they called, I was actually in Vegas with the USA basketball team. And I was like,
as you do.
I was like, I think I've reached the pinnacle. Like whatever you're describing here is not that interesting to me. And then my wife said, she's like, look, you've always said you wanted to go back at some point. Like you should at least have the conversation, entertain it. And they said, it'll take at least a year, no rush. Just let us know if we can consider you. So of course I said yes. And then 2 months later, they were like, when can you start? And so in January the following year, I moved back to Ghana to build the agency.
Now if I'm right, you're starting from scratch, right?
Starting from scratch.
That must have been pretty tough.
No team, no building, no contract with Nestle, by the way. No fee structure. It was literally like, go there, figure it all out. I was 29, which is the only reason I thought I could do this. If someone offered me that job, and I'd be like, get out of here. That sounds...
That is a disadvantage of age, isn't it? You've got to know how
you learn
how it could go wrong.
Difficult these things can be. But I still consider it like the greatest like learning experience. Like we built that agency from the ground up. We hired like an incredible team. A lot of our early stage folks that we ended up hiring were people that hadn't worked in advertising agencies, because I'd come from Wyden, and so I was spoiled as I work with like the best creatives in the world. And so I got to Ghana and I was trying to figure out like who the right folks were and how much we're going to hire from agencies, and ended up just finding a lot of people. My first copywriter was a physicist, but she wrote the most interesting blog in the country. Right. So it's like just finding these like unusual talents and then figuring out how we could apply it to the thing that we did. We started with one Nestle category. They had 9 different brands. We started with food because they were like, hey, you need to prove to us that this thing will actually work. And so it was like, try before you buy. So they gave us one. And by the end of the year, we had all 9 pieces of their business across 23 countries. We ended up winning a couple of brands for Procter & Gamble in Nigeria. We ended up winning Western Union for Africa. And so we went on this sort of charmed run for a few years where we built something that was like incredibly special. And, now there's multiple agencies in Ghana that are all alumni, headed by alumni.
From that team, from that age,
of that original sort of 12 people that we started with in a house in Accra.
That's amazing.
Just sort of trying to figure it out.
What was the hardest bit about that? Because that's a pretty audacious thing to do, isn't it?
Yeah, look, I think everything about it was hard.
Yeah.
I think figuring out building trust with Nestle early on was challenging because of where the relationship had been. So getting them to the place where they felt that we could trust us, finding talent, establishing the culture, and then operating across 23 markets, which like it's from a Western perspective, people look at Africa as like a thing.
Yes.
Africa's not a thing.
Yeah.
Africa is many things.
Yeah.
And so working across 23 countries, being able to build ideas that were regional enough that they could travel, but then figuring out how do you localize that across each place. You're operating in English and French. You're operating in multiple very specific local nuances and dialects and contexts, and figuring out how do you do work that travels across all of that. And just the complexity of the operating environment. Like you're dealing with a place where, at the time in 2009, 2010, you would probably 30% of the time the power is going to go out. That's just the reality.
It is reality, isn't it?
That is just the reality. So how do you plan for that? How do you think about that? Travel across the continent is super challenging. Like getting from Ghana to Mali, the easiest way is through Paris. Like you're just dealing with bizarre things, So I think everything about it was complex, but it was an incredible adventure. And like that team, I think we sort of, you're forged in the fire, right? And so like you're tied together sort of forever. But it was amazing.
I don't know if I'm putting too much together here, but if I take the discipline and the brand fundamentals at Leo, you take the kind of belief in transformation of creative at Wyden, and then you take the sort of startup hard yards. That all fits together quite nicely to explain DoorDash, doesn't it? In terms of
it does. Like, all of these things do come together. That is that is correct.
But before we get you had a bit of time at Facebook, didn't you?
Yeah, so I actually left when I left Ghana. Is when I took my first brand side job. Yeah. So I went to work at Bacardi. So I went to Bacardi to work for Sylvia Lagnado. She had just come over from Unilever, where she had done campaign for Real Beauty. She was building out her team. And I give her all the credit in the world for hiring the guy who was running an agency in West Africa to come be like one of her brand leaders over at Bacardi. And so I got to spend a few years working on the Bacardi brand itself and sort of re-architecting that thing and thinking about how do we get it back to its roots and communicating that was like an authentic Cuban rum. All of this had gotten lost over the years. And so a lot of the work we did was not just on the communication side, but like rationalizing the portfolio, revising the packaging, getting back to the roots, creating new variants. And so for me, it was my first education in the full canvas of like, oh, this is not just about the work. This is about all of it. This is about the strategy, the product, the pricing, the partnerships. How do we get into bars? I managed our global ambassador team. So all these people that have to go into bars to think about how do we sell into the trade? How do we build the right relationships? And so that was like a transformational, like a learning experience. Like I've thought of my career very much as like building blocks. And to your point, hopefully each of them builds up to the next thing. And the thing that's worked for me is like at each stage, I've had to learn something completely different. I've had to learn something I didn't know how to do, and figure out like a new thing. So at Bacardi, it was more about understanding the full picture. Came back to the States, did a short stint at the CSO of Foot Cone, and then I went to Facebook.
So you got brand side experience, and then you got media side experience, right? Completing the train set here.
Correct. Correct. And Facebook was incredible. I got there at a super interesting time. I was hired in 2015 for this role, which was to lead Facebook's efforts to grow the size of the internet, which, if you think about it, is a crazy brief.
Wow.
But the reality was that Facebook at the time had something like 2 billion people on all of its platforms. And there were sort of 4 billion people online, and you weren't in China. So like the only way you were going to grow was to actually grow the entire category. And so there was this project called internet.org, which was all about how do we increase internet access in all the places of the world that don't have it. And so I was hired as the head of marketing for that, which for me was incredible because it allowed me to combine like my passion for underserved communities, my experience as an African, as someone who actually understood these issues in a very core way of like, what does it mean to not have connectivity? And was part of that team that was working around the world with carriers. Like we built a product called Free Basics, where it would allow people to like search or surf a part of the internet to understand the value and then pay over time to start becoming paying customers. But that over time became a meaningful part of Facebook's growth efforts around the world. And so there was like the data thing. We're building satellites. We were doing Wi-Fi installations. So one of my proudest moments in that job was going back to Ghana for a Facebook thing, actually, but then ending up going to see my dad while I was there, because why not?
Yeah.
And there was a Wi-Fi installation that we had put up at Facebook that was like a mile away from my childhood home.
Really?
Where Wi-Fi, and you're like, this is actually happening. It's happening in the real world. It's happening on the ground.
Yeah. And
so I did that for about 1.5 years, and then they asked me to move over and take over brand and consumer marketing for all of Facebook. So I switched roles from the sort of emerging markets role into the core business. And that was a fascinating time to do that, because in 2015, when I got to Facebook, there was a Time magazine cover that said, Man of the Year, Mark Zuckerberg, should Mark Zuckerberg run for president? And sort of that's where Facebook was held in its esteem as of 2015, would come out of the Arab Spring, really thinking of this as a force for good. And then 2016 happens.
Yes.
And then we're into fake news and hate speech and election integrity. And so it was just a very fascinating time to be leading brand at a time when the company's values, its ethics, its products were being questioned in pretty harrowing terms, and really thinking about what we needed to do to earn back public trust.
Wow.
Yeah.
No small challenge then.
No,
you like a challenge.
It was quite chill. It was quite chill. Yeah.
But all this builds nicely, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Up to DoorDash.
Yeah.
So when did the call happen for that? And
so I left Facebook.
What made you
take
that?
I left Facebook in January of 19. And I left without knowing exactly what I was going to do next. But what I did know was that like Facebook's like the transformation Facebook needed to go through was not going to be a marketing thing, right? Like there was no marketing answer. The answers were going to be like the products, the portfolio, the policies, the platform, like all of these things are about like fundamentally changing the way that business operates. And I think Facebook has gone on to do a lot of those things, but it didn't feel like a marketing job. It's sort of like the wrong tool for that exercise. So I left, I took some time off. I was just sort of putzing around, taking my kids to school and doing all the sorts of things that you don't get to do every day. And I was looking at a bunch of different jobs, and DoorDash wasn't actually on my radar at the time. Like I knew what it was because I'd used it before. And then through that process, I ended up meeting, through a recruiter, I ended up meeting Tony Xu, who's the founder of DoorDash. And I was pretty far along the process with a few other companies. And so I was sort of like, I don't know if I want to start a new process. I should probably just say yes to a thing that's over here. And I met him, and I just was like, holy shit. I walked away just with an impression of him as a person who was like visionary, completely determined, very clear about what he wanted this company to be, had very high ambitions. And the thing I was looking to learn at that point, going back to my thing of like finding a building block each time, was I wanted to get into a very commercial role. I wanted to be in a place where marketing wasn't just about brand or about advertising, but actually being held to financial outcomes for the business. And so thinking of him, thinking of DoorDash, thinking about where we were at that moment, knowing that marketing would have to matter incredibly for this company to do what it wanted to do, it just felt like the right place to go at that time. So I started there in May of 2019.
But you didn't know the timing here because, like,
of course not.
I mean, like, it's fascinating that the year that followed, right? Obviously, COVID happens, the business floated with an IPA. Yeah. But I'd love to talk about that. But before we do, give us a sense of the backstory of how did DoorDash come into existence?
Yeah.
It's one of the most, successful US businesses, isn't it?
Like, it's an incredible business.
40 billion valuation in 10 years. Yeah. We talk about unicorns, that's right up there as one of those.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of it starts really with the founding story of the company, but even before that with who Tony is, right? So Tony moved from China when he was 5, and he moved from China with his parents. His dad was a professor at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign, so they're living in the suburbs somewhere in Illinois. And his mom was a doctor in China whose degrees didn't transfer, as it does for many immigrants, so you have to start over. And so for her, starting over looked like working a bunch of jobs, one of which was working at a restaurant. And so Tony grew up inside of a restaurant. He grew up as a server. He grew up like around the trade. And so fast forward many years later when he's at Stanford and they're trying to figure out what they want to do and what type of business they might build, he knew he wanted to build something for businesses, for small businesses. So they spent a week walking around Palo Alto interviewing all these businesses. Delivery was never the idea, but in talking to all of these businesses, it became very clear that like logistics and delivery and being able to fulfill orders, he's like, you'd be in this restaurant and you just hear the phone ring and no one would pick it up because they had no bandwidth to deal with it. And it's like, okay, there's an opportunity here. And at the time, delivery was a very New York, LA, San Francisco thing. It was not a thing that existed really outside of these major metros. And the prevailing wisdom in the entire category was that you could not make this business work in the suburbs, that there wasn't enough demand because like the cities had all this density, they had all these businesses, they had all the things you would need, but can you actually make it work? And so that was the first counterintuitive bet, which was like, we actually think there's a lot of demand here based on talking to these people. And so we're going to figure out if that's real. So they went away, they built a website, they uploaded 5 PDFs onto it and waited for the phone to ring. And when the phone rang, they would get in their own cars and go pick up the orders and deliver it themselves. And they would turn off the app when they were in class.
Oh, really?
They were students.
Oh, they were still students?
They were students.
Wow.
They would turn off the app when they were in class. And when they had time, they would turn it back on. They would turn the website back on so people could make orders. And very quickly it became evident that like, there's a lot of demand for a business like this. You could drive a lot of growth for the restaurants that were participating, and that you could continue to build this. And so that's how this thing started. And this is an intensely local business. So it's not the type of business you can flip a switch. You literally have to build it neighborhood by neighborhood, block by block, city by city. So you have to start over every time. You have to acquire drivers, you have to acquire restaurants, you have to acquire customers, and you have to keep doing it over and over again and making the system better. So after Palo Alto, the call was like, do you go to San Francisco or do you go elsewhere? And again, they made the counterintuitive choice. It was like, hey, San Francisco has a lot of competition. It's not clear that we can succeed there. Let's go to San Jose and figure out how we can build. And then that was another validation that the model will continue to work. And so DoorDash's initial strategy was all built from the suburbs in.
That's interesting. So you're growing the market rather than trying to compete with, let's say, Central San Fran or something. The other interesting thing about the way you tell the story, and this comes through on your website as well, is how you're starting from the restaurant's perspective, not from. You're not saying, oh, you get your quesadilla in 20 minutes or whatever. You're actually starting out from the restaurant's point of view. How do you make the restaurants
100%
succeed in its community?
100%.
The opposite way to, I think, how most other kind of meals delivery systems tend to talk about themselves.
Yeah, I think the thing that we worked out early on, and part of this is because like this was in Tony and actually the other founders' DNA, they'd all come from sort of small business families. But also the reality is that like in a model like this, we operate like a complex 3-sided marketplace. DoorDash only works if it works for all of those customers, right? It can't just work for the person who's at home wanting to order something. it has to work for the restaurant. That restaurant has to see value. They have to see growth. This has to be a way for them to acquire a new customer or to engage a customer. It has to work for the dasher who has to make the delivery. This has to be a way for them to earn. And then it has to work for the end customer, who's the person ordering it, in terms of saving them time. So we tend to think about business through the lens of like, there's 4 key value props that we have to get right all the time, and they're super hard. So it's selection, right? So how do I get every business on every block onto DoorDash, and how do I make it so that those businesses are successful? Because that's the only reason they're going to want to be here.
Yeah.
And then you think about quality. So like, if I'm going to deliver that, is it going to be delivered on time? Is it going to be delivered in the way that you expect it to be delivered? And so we have a whole bunch of metrics we think around the quality of what we're doing. Now that relies entirely on Dash's feeling.
It does, doesn't it?
They're getting compensated well, that they're earning, that they're able to maintain a flexible schedule, all the things that they want out of this business. And then we think about affordability. Like, can we do this in a way that is actually ultimately affordable for the end customer? Can we deliver the value? Like, are you willing to pay the trade-off between time and money? And like, what's that right point? And then like, assuming all of that goes well and you make an order, if it goes wrong, which at our scale, some percentage of orders will go wrong. The final pillar is service. Can we make it right? And so that's how we think about the entire business.
I think that bit is so important as well. How can you make it right? I mean, in the UK, I've been ordering off Deliveroo for years, and then it popped up with a 20% discount. And I was like, "Oh, this is fantastic!" Got through his checkout, and it didn't appear. And I'm like, "That's a bit weird." So anyway, I went through and ordered, and I thought I'll drop a little question over there. And then it came back and said, "Oh, it's only for new customers." And I'm like, "Oh." It didn't say that, right? And anyway, I just, what was really interesting is I then switched to Just Eat, just purely out of like, well, you're not going to look after me, and I've been ordering for years and years and years, and you can't even give me a discount. That's right, for new customers. And I thought that response in that moment, just turned me off. Now they'll never know that. I'm not going to kind of write in and go, by the way, you've lost weekly orders for the next 20 years.
Correct. If they're looking at their data, they'll know that they've lost an important customer.
Yes.
They'll know that they've lost an important customer. And ideally, and when we have these types of situations and you're like, okay, we've done something that is not right by the customer. How do you think about what you need to do to fix that? So one early story in Palo Alto was early on the business started. We didn't actually quite understand this is before my time, but we had a deluge of orders on the day that we did not anticipate. So there was a football game at Stanford. Drove a ton of demand. We didn't understand that this is what would happen. So crashed the app. Wow. And so you had all these people who had made an order, who we didn't really have a policy for how we refunded things. So this was the first time we'd seen this. And we made the call at the time to refund everyone. Even though there was no policy for it. Because that wiped out half the company's bank account for a bunch of students trying to figure this thing out. But it felt like the right decision to make, because to your point, like that customer who's been let down in that situation, if they feel like they're taken care of, they're going to come back. And by the way, if they don't feel like they will churn. And the data tells you that.
Generosity is so important. Is because important. You can see it as a cost to your business, but actually your greater cost is comes in the future, doesn't it? The amount of see. Which kind of brings us interestingly to you when you started at DoorDash, because then within 6 months, COVID happened. That must have, of course, it was both a challenge and an opportunity, wasn't it? But what happened in COVID to the business model?
Honestly, it's hard now to go back and think about that period. So the context is at the time, so in 19, DoorDash was already in hypergrowth, right? So this was a category that in general was growing super fast, driven a lot by what DoorDash was doing. So growing sort of 300% year over year. So like at a really good clip. And then you get to sort of March, and I remember because I'd been in Ghana. So I'd been in Ghana in February. And I remember getting off the plane in Ghana, and they were already doing contact tracing. And this was like late Feb, and we knew that there was this thing, but it was happening, it seemed in a very isolated way. So I was sort of like, these Ghanaians are overreacting, like chill, it's fine. And then I get back to the States, and I think 5 days later, the world shuts down. And it's sort of like, and we had no idea. We didn't actually know if delivery was going to be allowed. Like there were no rules around this. So in the first week, we're just trying to figure out like what is happening, what are the regulations around this? Like, are we an essential service? Are we not? How's this classified? But it became very apparent very quickly that this was the way that people were going to get everything. But we didn't know for how long. But what it required was the entire company going into like a complete all hands on deck. Once it became clear that we could operate and it became clear that we could be a lifeline for a lot of people, a lot of businesses, a lot of people looking to earn. And so like a few examples of this, like all of us started onboarding restaurants because we had so much demand coming into the system.
You must have done. Suddenly everyone had to
every
switch.
Business
didn't they?
that had
your
to switch their
cafe,
own model.
Your favorite bar.
And so now we're having to, like all of us are like manually
on
onboarding restaurants. My marketing team built the supply chain for personal protective equipment for Dashers. So how do we get sanitizer, gloves, masks, all of these things, all of these drivers who are now going out into the world in this challenging period. Going back to your thing around generosity, like we made a call as a business to cut commissions to all local restaurants by 50%. We were the only brand in the category to do this because we just understood that these restaurants were not going to make it if we're not getting enough orders and we're still paying us full rates. We said, look, for the time being, we're going to make a call to pull back on what we charge because we think it will actually be material. And then in a week from, I think March 13th is when the world shut down. By March 20th, we had an entirely new marketing campaign on air in 7 days from when this started. And the whole point was that it doesn't matter who you order with, whether you do that on DoorDash, on Grubhub, on whatever. But what matters is that like your favorite restaurants, the dining rooms are closed, but the kitchens are open for delivery. And you need to go out and support these businesses because that's what's going to get them through this. And so we pivoted the entire company to really be in support of like all of our audiences and try to figure out and we did daily stand-ups from March to October. Daily stand-ups from March to October that year. It's weekends included. Because we just needed to understand what's happening. How do we respond? How can we provide value in this moment? What do we need to change about our business? We built, so some things that are fascinating now because we take them for granted. Contactless delivery did not exist in 2019. It was always handed to me, right? Like you went to the door to meet someone. So all of a sudden you go, oh my God, we actually have to rebuild this entire flow. And then we have to educate everyone that's how this thing works now because you can't have any contact. And so we built that in probably about 10 days and shipped it. But then that leads to things like more missing and incorrect. Because now like the person has put it there, but I don't know exactly.
Hand it over. You haven't got the handover moment, have you?
So there's all of these things that we had to figure out. We figured out things like instant pay, right? So for both restaurants and Dashes, how do we, rather than make you wait a week, we actually have to build a product that pays you today if that's what you want. So there's all of these things that we had to break and rebuild over that period.
That's incredible. It was massive accelerant to the business. I remember I was actually in my system one job working with Deliveroo at the time, and we were kind of measuring some of the advertising. I remember when they turned around to me and said, it doesn't really matter because we're doubling every 6 months. So, whether it's 100% or 120% is kind of like, we're just trying to keep supply going. I mean, it literally was a case of we just can't fulfill it because the uplift in demand that created was just incredible.
Correct.
Wow. So what a time. So, the business has been funded with a lot of round of C capital, hasn't it? Lots of rounds. In fact, I think there's a round H, I think, wasn't it?
Oof. I actually don't remember if we got to H, but yes, we had multiple
which is quite impressive.
Funding,
I'm not sure when it runs out.
That's right. I don't know if we got to H. I remember joining when we were Series D. I don't remember how many after that.
Quite a few series. But that led up, of course, to the IPO the following year as well, coming out of that. So what was it like working in a business that was preparing? So you've gone through this enormous shock of COVID, which you had to, pivot and change and focus on, keeping you and your restaurants afloat. But then how do you prepare then for a year later then to float the
it was, for me, it was like one of the most interesting sort of moments because you don't often get to be inside a business when it's going through that process. I remember things that I didn't even know existed, which is like taking a pitch from the stock exchanges to decide which one we were going to go with. Like you never, we think about pitches on the agency side, right? But you're sort of like, no, this is a competitive
Who are you going to give the pitch? Who are you going to give it to?
And which banks are you going to go with and which lawyers? And so all of these, there was just like new language, new process. And then for me, being able to be part of the team that actually helped write the company story and the S1 that went to investors and to the public that explained, our mission about empowering local economies, how we do that, how we build that, the origin story of the company, a lot of what we've chatted about already. But being able to sort of be in that room in a creative process, that was also like a legal process and a financial process, because we're in this writing room and it's like you and bankers and lawyers.
Yeah.
And it was just like fascinating to sort of like work through how we bring this story to market, how we talk about what DoorDash is and what the potential for that company and sort of where we see it going.
Yeah.
And I think it was like a great moment to both realize the vision up until that point, but also set the stage for what was to come, right? Because one of the things that we talk about often is sort of this notion of getting 1% better every day. And for us, it's always about like, what's next? Like, what's the next phase of this company? And at that time, we were largely a restaurant business. We had started to expand into new categories, but it was about articulating the vision of being able to get everything in your neighborhood. And what would that mean? And what sort of impact could we drive to communities and to customers? So being able to be part of like charting that out and thinking about what that looked like. And then obviously being part of the company and figuring out all the things that needed to be true, like compliance and, you know, what does it mean when we're now public? What things have to change? What things have to stay the same? How do we maintain our values and our operating philosophy, even as like the world changes around us? And being part of a company that also treated this as like a milestone, but nowhere near the end. You know, one of the things that I loved about that day, we're doing all this work leading up to it. And because it was COVID, we actually didn't know how we were going to go public, like physically, right? Because it's like, do we get to be in New York? And so we were planning for multiple scenarios, which is like, do you actually go to the stock exchange?
You can get to ring the bell and do the whole thing.
Right. So it's like, are you going to go to the stock exchange? It's like, well, that was one plan, but turns out you couldn't travel.
Yeah.
So then it's like, okay, we had another plan, which is like, we actually want to do this at a local restaurant and have the entire leadership team.
Yeah.
Then that got shut down because this was Omicron. At this point, we're now in the second wave. So like, that gets shut down. So we're like, okay, now we're in a world where it's like fully virtual. And so we're like working through all of these options in real time. And the day before we went public, the working group that was working on all the things, we were chatting about, okay, what does tomorrow look like? Do we have everything buttoned up? And we had our weekly business review, which is the key meeting we have across the company every week. And it was that day as well. It was later in the afternoon. And someone said, do we think we're going to have the WBR tomorrow, given that like all morning will be like all of this going public stuff? And I said, not only will we have it, no one will mention that we went public today. And no one believed me.
Really?
And we went into that meeting.
Yeah.
And there was no discussion about going public. It was like, what's going on with that number? What's going on here? Like, it was just very clear, like, this is a milestone. And like, we celebrated that this morning.
We go again.
But we go again.
That's good. That's a good philosophy.
Yeah.
How much of the plan that you created and you sold to people, you know, at the time, because you're right, you had to sell a vision, sell a future plan, tell the story.
Right.
So how much of that has kind of then played out? Because presumably that gave you a real focus in terms of the next chapter of the business. How much of that actually kind of came to life?
It's incredible. If you go back and look, even before, let's call it like the S1, which is the official document. If you go back to the initial, 12 years ago when they made their submission to Y Combinator, like so much of what we thought this thing could be has come to pass. But the reality is that like we're still in the very early innings. So if you think about it this way, which is we thought that this is ultimately a multi-category, multi-vertical business where we're empowering all sorts of businesses to grow. And you sort of go, okay, well, last year, DoorDash, for its merchant partners, drove $50 billion in sales. And you go, okay, we think this is the thing that's going to enable lots of people to earn. Last year in 2023, $15 billion to Dashers. And so the scale and the amount of like economic activity that this platform is generating, I think those are things that we thought we could do, but you don't know it until you've done it, right? You have the aspiration. We have this thing of like, dream big, but start small, right? So like you have the aspiration, you articulate what that is, but like it only happens if you will it into being, right? So the work has just been about how do we continue to do that? And so today you look at DoorDash now and you're like, you open that app and it's a materially different experience than it was 5 years ago when it was 100% restaurants. And today, like every shop in your neighborhood, we have more non-restaurant stores on our platform than any other.
How do you choose which innovation to do? Because you've done some pretty cool stuff. I mean, drone delivery is coming.
Sure.
Which is the one that caught my eye. It's like, but that's the reality, isn't it? I mean, it's not just a sort of a sci-fi
100%
kind of story.
I think the thing that we try to do is generally work backwards from the customer.
Yeah.
Right. So really thinking about like, what are we understanding both from our data about how people are actually behaving on the platform, or about the conversations we're getting, about the feedback, or about the stuff that comes through our support interactions because we got something wrong. So trying to understand what are all of these inputs, and then that ends up like being the thing that drives the innovation engine.
Yeah.
So like one tactical example, which is a product that I love, if you've used DoorDash in the States, it's a thing called Double Dash, where you make an order and then it starts a timer and it says, hey, in the next 15 minutes, if you want to add something from these other stores that are close by to the first order you made, because we have the logistics capacity, we can see all the stores that are there, we will batch it and have the Dasher bring it to you for no extra cost. Right. So we're going to like create a thing that delivers more value to you, but not charging you any money for it.
Yeah.
And the reason we built that is because we saw that behavior. We saw people ordering and then ordering again 10 minutes later.
Well, because they suddenly went, oh, I forgot this.
I've got this thing,
but I don't have
want
the
to
thing
get
to go
this
with
thing.
it. Yeah.
And so you go, okay, that's really interesting. Like, can we build a product that
really
actually
good.
solves for that problem? And so a lot of what we do is looking at that. And if you think about, Dash Pass as our subscription product, which, for $10 a month gives you $0 delivery fees, reduced service fees, and future benefits to come. But you look at that product, and that's inspired by the fact that we understand that affordability is one of the key barriers to engaging in a category like this. So particularly if you're a heavy user, how do we make it more affordable for you? How do we constantly bring the prices down? We revamped our merchant sort of how we charge merchants based on feedback from them. Because, 3 years ago, the complaint was like, hey, all these delivery companies charge me a flat rate of 30%. That's very expensive. How do I make a profit? And so we rebuilt how we charge. We created an entirely new product that gave merchants choice and control in terms of where they wanted to play in our system. And so a lot of what we do is really driven by like, what are we hearing? What are we understanding? And what do people need, and how might we show up in a way that like delivers value to them and then delivers value back to the business?
Yeah, I love that kind of win-win. And
100% is the only way.
Yeah. And the storefront I thought was quite clever as well, because you're building like businesses, online business, and behind the scenes, you're powering it, but it's coming from them as well. Which I thought is amazing. It allows lots of small businesses to act big and get the advantage of scale, right?
That's exactly right.
Every business can be a scale business.
Correct.
It's pretty cool.
And there's a lot of businesses that don't have that capability themselves.
Yeah.
Like a lot of SMBs do not have a tech team, do not have a marketing team, do not have like a way to build these things. So it's like, okay, how do we take everything we've learned about how we've built this business, and then how do we do that in partnership and on behalf of these merchants to give them their own virtual storefront? And if you think about one of the major shifts in 2020 was that every business had to become an e-commerce business. It just became clear that you could not operate as a pure bricks and mortar business. So then if you've never done that before, how do you do it? And so being able to be there as a partner to businesses as they did that has been phenomenal.
Because that's what I think is interesting about your business model. You start by, let's say delivering restaurant foods, and now effectively you're becoming e-commerce, but you're also becoming retail media, aren't you? Effectively, because basically the amount of people that are interacting with you, you now are a shop front.
Yeah, that's right.
For lots and lots of businesses.
That's right. And
presumably the retail media must give you another.
That's been a really interesting business. We've been focused on it over the past couple of years, and a lot of what we've been trying to do is to like build it in a way that's like concordant with our mission and our values and how we operate and what we're trying to do, which is to say, okay, if we're in the business of empowering local economies, what does that mean for how we build a retail media network? So like one of the things I'm proudest of is our sponsored listings product, which like these are common products on any of these sorts of places where you search for a thing and you can be in the auction, but we only charge on a conversion. We don't charge on a click. We don't charge on an impression, because if you're a small business, you can't spend a marketing dollar that you don't understand what the return is going to be. You need to feel relatively confident that like, if I spend $1, I'm going to get X dollars back. And so a lot of even how we design those products for our retail media network is informed by how we think about who the customer is and what they need. So that's been,
that's game changing, isn't it? Because the amount of suspicion around you buying views, likes, even engagement, but you're not actually buying conversion.
Correct.
Are you? And you just don't know kind of, behind the scenes what gets lost in the transactions.
Correct.
But if you're buying conversion,
you can feel very very confident.
Yeah.
So that's been interesting. And then figuring out how do you balance the ad engine with the actual mechanics of the platform itself, because what you also don't want to do is to turn it into a pure pay for play.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to, both your ad results have to be as good as your organic results.
Yeah.
And so figuring that out has been super interesting.
Oh, that's very interesting. Love it. Well, am I right in saying as well that you deliver, is it like 2 in every 3 meal deliveries come from you guys now?
Yeah. So we're on the restaurant side, 67% of the category, which, 5 years ago was about half that.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah.
And what role is the kind of, you've done some pretty big communication. We'll come back to Cannes now. So,
sure.
But let's start in the Super Bowl because at System 1, we've been testing Super Bowl ads for many, many years.
Yeah.
We test all of them. And one of the best bits of my job is every Super Bowl, we get the team together and within 1 hour of every ad breaking,
Amazing.
we've gone out there, we've got hundreds of responses, we've got the results live up, live on the system, and we have a team that kind of work through the night, getting all the results together. What have we learned? So the next day, I get the fun job of kind of sharing who won, what have we learned, what's kind of works, this kind of thing. But I remember doing it in 2021. Your Sesame Street ad came third.
Wonderful.
It got 4.7 stars out of 5, so almost top of the scale.
Yeah,
absolutely brilliant. But it was a wonderful bit of work. It's kind of maybe going back to your Leah Burnett days. It's kind of like the basics of advertising done really well. You know what I mean? In terms of like, you got a story, you got humor, you got a song, you got actors, you got famous characters.
That's right.
And through doing that, you show off what you're all about, which is whatever you want.
You can find it here.
On DoorDash.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it was our first time at the Super Bowl. So the sort of inbuilt pressure that comes with that, not even from.
So you were a rookie that year, right? That was the first time you'd done.
First Super Bowl.
Impressive.
First Super Bowl ad.
I will need to go and check this.
Yeah.
But I don't know of a rookie that's come third on our system.
We'll take it.
So I reckon this is like breaking news.
We'll take it. It was our first appearance of the Super Bowl, and the way we tend to think about that particular moment is like, do we have something really important to say or to demonstrate that requires that level of scale?
Yeah.
Because a lot of the way we think about marketing at DoorDash is like you end up in sort of these sorts of like odd debates in the marketing community about like short and long term and sort of all of these things and brand versus performance. We tend to think of all of those things as like the customer doesn't care. The job is to like drive the business today and grow the brand over time. And by the way, it turns out like building a bigger business is probably one of the single biggest things you can do for the brand. Yes. And so we don't trade off between those things, but that means that when you go into a thing like a Super Bowl, you really have to think about how do we make sure that like this will deliver both short and long term wins for the business. Like I don't exist in the luxury of like, I'll tell you what the brand results are 8 months from.
Call me back next year.
Call me back next year and I'll tell you how it did. So, and I think in that moment, we felt that the most important thing to say was to start to signal to the market that like we've actually gone beyond what you think of us for. And that's actually been the journey we've been on every Super Bowl now that we've been at, which is like, how do we tell you about a net new offering? And so Sesame Street just felt like the perfect, if we deliver everything in your neighborhood, what better way than the most iconic neighborhood in history? And you and I were chatting about this earlier, but it also has like an incredible nostalgic pull. There's no one in America that doesn't know what Sesame Street is. And it has, great, warm and fuzzy sort of like feelings.
It's cross-generational, really isn't it? Like we all grew up with it.
Correct.
Everyone's probably got kids that are into it now. It's just, it does emotion, does it brilliantly. I mean, what I love about, if I take your 2021 compared to what you did this year, is I guess that was like what you might call a kind of brand ad, but actually did, in fact, on the System 1 data, it did very high on start and very high on spike, which is the short-term measure, did both. This year, you had what you might call a promotion or activation.
Correct.
But you delivered it in such a incredible way.
Yeah.
But I saw it and I was like, how the hell do you pull that off? So just explain, DoorDash, all the ads as an idea, because it's a bit bold.
Yeah. So we went into the Super Bowl with, similar brief as which is like, okay, we have new things to communicate. We have new categories that we're part in. How do we really start to let you know that like whatever you want, you can find on DoorDash? How do we continue to hammer that home, but do it in a way that feels really disruptive? And so we went through, like, as you typically do, rounds and rounds of work. And then, those just literally the random slide in the deck that sort of went, well, what if we just like delivered everything from the Super Bowl from every ad? Oof. I was like, that is going to be incredibly painful.
Yeah.
But that is absolutely what we should try and figure out how to do. And there was no real playbook for doing something like this. So we started with that as sort of the nugget of the thought, which is like, could you actually do it? And what would it look like to do it? And then that evolved into, okay, what's the mechanic? How do we get partners on board? Because one of the things we said very early on is like, this can be like watching one of those sports movies where everyone's wearing a generic jersey because it just doesn't land. This actually has to be the brands in the Super Bowl leaning in. We want to actually partner with all of them. We want to like light up our social channels. And then we ended up building this thing where in a lot of ways, the ad itself was actually the least important part of the ecosystem that we built. So we went like, we're going to create a 3-week journey that just drives insane excitement and engagement around the notion that DoorDash is going to deliver everything from the Super Bowl to one lucky winner. But we're not going to tell you how you can win it. You have to watch the ad for that. So we got influencers, we got all the brands. So every time a brand dropped their trailer or their ad, we had this cart and we would add it to the cart. So it's like a BMW is now in the cart. And we were talking to all of these brands. And so we built this cart that was updating in real time. And so every time someone came and then
as the ad breaks, it drops in the car. Is that how it would work?
No, like, so yes, so imagine it's 2 weeks before the Super Bowl and BMW is like,
oh, see, they've signed up. They're going to be in.
They're going to be in. And so it's like,
brilliant.
And so we're using all of that. And we had relationships with all these brands. I spent a month talking to all of them, getting everyone to play. And we ended up just having like an enormous amount of fun with it because it just generated so much content where every time there was a thing that happened, we brought on an amazing influencer, Alani, who was our official Dash pundit, who was reporting on everything that was happening with a bunch of influencers in all these subcategories. So there were people that are super into cars. We had them talking every time a car is like, yo, you can get the new Kia when the DoorDash thing happens. And so we had all of this going for 3 weeks leading up to the game. And so we were able to generate like a real groundswell of anticipation. And then our ad, which we can chat about, that placement, but our ad was the first ad break after the 2-minute warning towards the end of the game. So the very first ad
you got all the ads had broken up to that point. So you'd seen what you could win.
But we knew all of this, but some of it we were updating, we're having to update in real time because not every advertiser discloses. So we had. So
there were the things we
didn't know. So there were things we didn't know.
So if luxury yachts of the world decided to advertise, or private planes,
I guess maybe we have to give someone a yacht, or maybe we give them a seat on the yacht. Like we have to figure out what the thing is. And then there were brands that didn't have like physical things. So like there's this campaign for Jesus.
There was
called He Gets Us. And they have like 4 spots.
Deliver Jesus.
So it's like, are you going to deliver Jesus? We're like, not sure, but we can deliver you merchandise. they have like amazing water bottles
down there.
Yeah, exactly. So there was all of this stuff that we just had to figure out on the fly.
Wow.
And then our ad aired, and it was 2,000 character promo code.
That was the thing that got me. It was just carried on forever.
Yeah, just carried on forever that you had to go enter in order to win this thing. And we legitimately did not know how it was going to go because it hadn't been done. So we felt really good about the excitement we had been able to drum up. But like once we dropped that thing, we're like, are people going to do it? Are people going to tell us? Like, are people going to be pissed off? Like what happens once they see that this is not like the easiest thing in the world to win? We ended up getting 8 million entries. It was astonishing. And we have all these great reaction clips of people who missed the end of the game. Because
they were trying to pause, rewind,
enter the code where people trying to sell it.
Your short code wouldn't have worked, right?
Absolutely not.
You need the long code.
You need all of it.
Pause it.
You need all of it. We had people who were trying to sell it on Cash App. They're like, DM me, I'll give you the code. And then an hour later, someone solved it and posted it on Reddit. And then the whole thing went nuts. It was just like it was a social experiment of sorts. But it was fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely amazing. Yeah. And in terms of like executing this kind of thing, which agencies do you work with to kind of bring this kind of stuff to life? How does that work?
Yes.
Or is it in-house that you do it?
Yeah, so we have an in-house, terrific in-house agency called Superette. And Superette partners with external partners. So some work we execute entirely in-house. Some work we partner with agencies externally to do it. We've partnered with and continue to partner with the Martin Agency, with Gut, and with Wieden and Kennedy. This particular Super Bowl work was a partnership between Superette and Wieden and Kennedy. To bring that to life.
Yeah, that's a kind of formidable mix. That in a way, I look at that and I go, you got your brand basics covered with Martin Agency. Correct. You got your big stunt ideas with Gut, and then you've got your absolutely classic, emotional, memorable kind of above the line Wieden and Kennedy. That's quite a mix, isn't it?
Yeah, it's been, and I think the model we've built also feels like a really good partnership. One of the things that we talk about a lot is like this notion of collaboration and like radical collaboration, because this is not, we try to make it not a client agency sort of relationship. It's sort of like, hey, we're extensions of each other's teams. So like, how do we just get the best work out and clear as much of the ego out of the way as possible and just like jam on the thing? And one of the things I'm proudest of on this particular thing was the degree of collaboration between our teams, but also between all the brands, getting all the brands on board, getting our social teams across all those brands working together, getting the agency teams working together. Like that's what ended up powering this thing, was like everyone was able to let go of like, this is my thing. And it's like, no, this is our thing. How do we make it the
hard
biggest,
work to do that?
Yes, how do we make it the biggest thing possible?
It's harder than it sounds. But the business is built on collaboration, isn't it? In terms
100%.
of the restaurants, the
100%.
dashers, and the customer as well. I thought I'd round up actually, just because I love how you describe your culture at DoorDash in terms of kind of being leaders, being doers, being learners. Describe a little bit about the culture and how you operate, because you're valued at 40 billion, which is insane, but you still feel like a startup and still acting like it. What are the secrets to the kind of how the culture operates? Yeah,
so I think DoorDash at its core is like an ops and logistics business. It's the best executing business I've ever been around. And at the core of that, there's a bunch of values, but I think there's a few that are sort of very DoorDash. So one of them is like operate at the lowest level of detail, right? One of them is be an owner, bias for action. And a lot of the stories we've talked about today actually fall into that. So like, I'll take be an owner. Like this Super Bowl thing was one of those things that's like, it's a hard idea to get through a business because it's like unfamiliar and no one really knows exactly how it's going to work and you don't know what's on the other end of it. So you have to have like a lot of faith. But that only works if you have a culture that says, hey, by the way, the only thing we care about, Kofi, is that you have a set of goals. So you're the owner. So you get to make the call on whether you think this thing hits those goals. If it doesn't, we'll have a different conversation, but you get to own that decision. And so like that is like a really practical example of like how those values show up. We talk about things like a bias for action. We chat about how we responded in COVID. Like this is a company that operates on a daily, hourly, weekly cadence. We're looking at data all the time. We're responding to things as we understand them happening in real time, week over week. We're actually looking at our business and allocating dollars to places that we think those dollars need to go. So the business is managed in a very real time way. And, my boss likes to say that like, if you could do something yesterday, do it then. It's just sort of like, because time is a currency, right? And the quicker you move, the quicker you can actually learn what's working and what's not and how do you iterate. And then, sort of operating at the lowest level of detail, like we tend to think about how do you take all these complex problems and sort of like break them down to the atomic unit, right? So when we're thinking about things like how do we grow, that's like a very broad question, but like we understand that like one of the inputs to growth is selection.
Yeah.
So now the task becomes who's the team that has to go out and acquire all of these businesses onto the platform. And that's like an atomic unit. Like who's the team that's thinking about pricing? So like everything we take and break down into like the most granular detail and then like build it back from there. We chat about customer obsession already. So there's
that runs through everything, doesn't it?
Correct.
That everything you've done has been informed by the customer and the customers in the three kind of verticals.
3 and now 4 when you talk about retail media.
Yes, of course.
Now you talk about advertisers. And so like, what do we understand about what they need and what we need to build for them?
Yeah.
A lot of it is at the heart of how we run it.
Well, it's very exciting, Kofi. It's been quite a wild ride, and
it's been fun.
Like you've been dangling drones at me like this. What crazy things next? I don't know, but it's a lot of fun. Massive congratulations on your Cannes win as well this year.
Oh, thank you.
And
thank you.
You did the complete top trumps, didn't you? You had like titanium, gold, silver, bronze, and many shortlists. So
and I think the thing for us, that we try to index on is like things like can are an outcome, but they're not a goal and they're not an input into our process. Like we win when we do our job by like meeting customers and meeting their needs and delivering a thing that we think is memorable and interesting. But we don't get out of bed to go to can.
Yeah.
We get out of bed to meet our customers' needs. If we do that well, hopefully you end up with that sort of outcome. But like there's this great book called The Score Takes Care of Itself, which is about Bill Walsh and the 49ers dynasty. And we sort of think about can in that way. We're just like, we don't control any of that.
Yeah.
All we control is the inputs and doing the work. And then after that, the score hopefully takes care of itself.
I like it. Well, that's a perfect place to end, I reckon. Kofi, mate, thank you so much. Been a blast.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you very much for listening or watching Uncensored CMO. I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please do hit the subscribe button wherever you get your podcast. If you're watching, hit subscribe there as well. I'd also love to get a review. Reviews make a big difference on other people discovering the show. So please do leave a review wherever you get your podcast. If you want to contact me, you can do. I'm over on X at Uncensored CMO or on LinkedIn where I'm under my own name, John Evans. Thanks for listening and watching. I'll see you next time.